Yeah. And so like the reality is like the cost of that is actually very high, in terms of production time, because we're actually paying, ourselves and employees now, as opposed when we weren't paying anybody. You didn't have any. You were like, oh, time
ourselves.
Who cares? Yeah. And so it's very easy to.
I'll be just as broke at the end of this as I was at the beginning.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter.
Nothing has changed.
Butterscotch shenanigans.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 438 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm drinking honey lemon tea.
Ooh.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's October 19th, 20 Jubilee. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. I got it in. I got it
in there.
Just got to squeeze it in. We need a soundboard where I can say that, record it, speed it up, double it, like those little disclaimers in medical commercials, just bam, slam that thing right as soon as I get my last word in, and then we're good to go.
Every time I hear my wife listening to a podcast, it sounds like those disclaimers, because she listens to everything on like 2x speed, So
Me too.
I just hear just this like complete nonsense stuff, and I'm like,
Chaos.
I know you can get used to it, but every time I hear it just like in a drive-by, I'm just like, what the fuck? What am I listening to?
I've tried to do that so many times, and I've actually found that I listen to podcasts better if I listen to them at 3/4 speed.
Oh, really?
Oh my God. That sounds
because my mind wanders all the time. And
yeah, so then not too much has happened.
I miss something
by the time you get back.
So it's like, no matter if it's going too fast, then I can't even. I have to like really pay attention to it, and which I can't do, and if I stop paying attention for like 2 seconds, I've missed like a whole sentence, and then I've got to
speed it
back,
up so that I pay more attention to it, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
It's going so fast that I'm like, wow.
Yeah, I used to do like 1.75 because I was trying to capture kind of similarly, like it was easier to pay attention when it's like, or I guess it was easier to make myself have to pay attention, because like, if I wanted, I would lose stuff, but that way also I could have to pay attention for less time. Right. But for a few years now, I think especially like when we're getting in the car and stuff, when I would drive to work, and all of that, like being able to get a whole bunch done really quickly and then get out of the car again, was kind of nice. But ever since then, I actually mostly listen to just happen to like hear some stuff that I think might be interesting, but so that there's something happening, though. You know what I mean? So like, so I don't want to speed it up, because then I consume my podcast episodes too fast.
That's true.
Because a lot of what I'm doing is just kind of zoning in and out, but
you're decorating time with the podcast.
just decorating time. Yeah.
You just need a little podcast garnish, when you're doing your chores, or
it just
hanging
makes
out
everything a little less boring if there's some.
So you don't want to be fast, because that's not decorating anymore. That's,
and it also makes it harder to do other stuff, So like I kind of just am always listening. Like I get up in the morning when I'm getting ready for the day, I'm just listening to podcasts,
You guys ever experience this thing where like, I remember this pretty vividly, especially from like growing up, is being at like a family reunion or some kind of like a large get together, and then being like, I'm gonna go take a nap. I'm fucking tired, right? And like going off and finding some corner or something. And then as you're kind of like drifting in and out of sleep, you kind of like catch snippets of like conversations and jokes and stuff. That's what it's like, right? It's like you got a podcast going on, and your brain is kind of like phasing in and out of the listening experience.
Well, I think it's just also most of the time, it's this phenomenon that we're always talking about, right? Where the more you learn about stuff, the more the information sources that you have access to are just kind of stuff you mostly already know, or that isn't
it's high level
much beyond that, where you need to pay a lot of attention to it to get it, So a lot, so much now too of like what my podcast listening experience is just filtering largely noise, right? It's just mostly stuff I already know. So having it be something that just kind of happens in the background, because it is like every once in a while I'm like, ooh, I actually want to know about that thing that I just heard, and then I'll like go back a bit and like actually focus on it until that part's over, and then kind of let myself drift it into the background again. So it also kind of just serves as a mechanism to just to kind of make things a little less boring because there's always just something going on, which is good for ADHD brains,
Yeah.
But then over time, I've just had to do that to be able to get stuff to float above the noise without otherwise.
It's just a volume game.
It's just a volume problem. Yeah.
It's something. I've been playing a ton of Baldur's Gate since it came out. Starting to kind of ramp down because I've done like every conceivable thing in the game. But toward the beginning, I was looking up a lot of YouTube videos and stuff about like interesting tips or like cool spells that you wouldn't normally think about, whatever. And that kind of like primed my YouTube algorithm, I guess. So now it's just like showing me a trillion Baldur's Gate videos whenever I open it. But now that I'm way deeper into the game, it's like you're talking about, Adam.
Yeah.
All I'm getting is videos that are like, have you ever used this spell before? It's crazy. I'm like, yeah, like 1,000 times.
I was born wielding that spell.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is true that like the deeper you go, like the more you know about stuff, the more likely it is that anything that you see, you already know it. You've already seen it. I mean, you got to like kind of sift through, which takes forever. But
especially for the kind of content too, right? Because the kind of content there's always the most of is the kind of content that people
appeals to everyone.
That appeals to everybody, or that is more readily makeable by the most number of people, which means it's always stuff that if you're in an actual process of learning, is like it's just in your rearview mirror.
Yep. Stuff you just did as a new player or something.
Yep.
Well, so this episode, we don't have a ton of news. Some stuff has happened. I think like the Unity CEO stepped down and the Microsoft Activision Blizzard King merger thing is now finalized, which we mentioned last week. But there's like
they're just sort of facts.
It's just the regular stuff kind of happening now in the industry. Nothing sort of earth-shattering. And then Crashlands 2 production is just cruising forward. That's going well. So we thought, we'll just hit some questions this episode and see what our listeners want to know about. So these questions come from podcast.bscotch.net. The highest upvoted question comes from Panit Powaacka, who says, having gotten into this podcast around the launch of Levelhead, I can't help but feel sad to have missed the vast majority of the events like Shenanicon or the Shenanijam that you all used to put on. The three of you have extensively explained why you don't do these things anymore, but are there any ideas you would have liked to do that never got a shot?
Things we also didn't decide to do? Is that sort of the category?
Or we wanted to do, but then,
decided not to.
Yeah.
I mean, related to that, we always wanted to have really good merch, like some Levelhead plushies, that kind of stuff. Those are the things that, like, we had a merch shop for a while, which you probably also missed because that was pre-Levelhead too. Did we sell those shirts? No, I don't think we did.
We did a run of them.
Did a run, didn't we?
Yep.
Pretty small run though. But it was one of those like
probably 50 of them out there in the wild somewhere.
Yeah. We were at a merch shop basically since the launch of original Crashlands for several years. But it was just such a pain in the ass and so
it was a loss.
Yeah, it was definitely a loss in every way in terms of time spent and money coming in versus going out.
It's mainly the reality of managing real inventory is not.
It's not in our wheelhouse.
It's not particularly easy. So it's
and it's a scale game, right? Like it only really works at a sufficient scale.
Yeah, I think plushies is definitely in that category of stuff that would be nice to do, but is like hard to do for all the reasons. And honestly, like, Shenanicon and the Shenanijam, they're kind of in the same category where it's like, these are all things that are very fun to do or to have done. But doing them is when you're contending also then with just the limited resources that a team of our scale has, is it just always ends up being really challenging. Like, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z to put on this community event, but that's delaying our game now by X, Y, and Z time. And it's definitely not gonna do what that would do in terms of costs or whatever else, So I think that's really the bulk of it, It's just like, it's hard to put on really good events. And that's also one of the things, like, we're not just trying to throw something together, And so
if you want an event worth attending, then it needs to be big. Like, it needs to have enough things going on in the event, and also, reveals of stuff that is exclusive. You have to have reasons to go, right? Like, I think back in the days that we kind of started that up, I I personally had, as a big fan of like Blizzard and seeing BlizzCon or like I think Minecraft had their Minecon kind of going around that time, and so starting to see like these studios or these communities kind of forming together to like have annual events to celebrate their games and stuff like that. And I know like at that time I had a kind of vision of like wanting to, be on the stage and like unveiling stuff to the big crowd, but even having done like so having given talks at GDC and doing the small conventions that we did and all that, now I look back and I'm like, no, I just want to like work on my games and publish them, and I want people to enjoy them, but I don't need to be in a spotlight with a megaphone.
Yeah,
that's.
Well, and I think I agree with that too. That in the earlier days, it also kind of felt like being a public figure was kind of like what was kind of it felt like it was required, right? Because we're out there looking at all the other successful indies and stuff, right? But of course, the only ones you see are the ones who have become a public figure, right? So we're talking like Rami Ismail and a jillion other people,
huge amount of time. Like I think at one point we looked at the volume of Rami's tweets and kind of like how many hours a year, is he spending on Twitter, and it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, right?
Yeah,
maybe even thousands.
And if you're making it part of your job, it's a significant part of your job, right? And if you're trying to do it in addition to what your job is, then it's going to cut into everything else that you want to do, right? It's a really big undertaking, and I think it felt like in the earlier days, since again, the only thing you see are the public figures, that was part of what the success path looked like. You had to have that component. And so that was a lot of why I kind of felt like we needed to, but I also like kind of wanted to, like it seemed fun, to have.
It is fun. I think it is enjoyable. It's just like, I think it's always the prioritization problem, just like all the way back down, which is like, if you're spending, we do this in the studio, we occasionally people give talks on the studio team, and, we set aside say like, 30 hours for a 60-minute talk sort of a thing.
It's a whole work week plus,
Yeah. And so like the reality is like the cost of that is actually very high, in terms of production time. And so I think what it is, it's a combination of like both moving to a place where you're because we're actually paying, ourselves and employees now, as opposed to when we weren't paying anybody, you didn't have any, you were like, oh, time ourselves, who cares? Yeah. And so it's very easy to,
I'll be just as broke at the end of this as I was at the beginning.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter.
Nothing has changed.
But I think now it's a very different thing where it's like, oh, wow, yeah, that actually costs a lot of money to do.
Yeah, so is it worth it? The answer just increasingly becomes no. Well, this is true for kind of everything, right? Like, yeah, I think to that point, because now we're looking at like where we're supporting a team of 7 full-time people, 8 full-time people. And it's all of our livelihoods, right? And so, we're looking out on our runway, and our runway right now is healthy, but it's not bulletproof,
Yep.
We still got to launch Crashlands 2. We still got to make the next game. Like we still got to keep.
And each one of these things takes years, So like the sheer cost of running an actual professional studio that people's livelihoods actually depend on, right, is very different than like trying to figure out how to break into the industry as just burning through your savings, not paying anything, and not really having a future, like
definitely.
It's very different. And so I think the cost of that is, it's just so enormous that now everything else when we're looking at doing, we're like, well, we could, but it cuts our runway and doesn't actually make it more likely that we get to make the next game,
Yeah. So I think also there's the trap that you can fall into, right? Which is the whole like hours worked is the metric thing, right? And I'm not trying to make that argument where it's basically like anything you're doing that's not directly, putting you one next line of code or one next pixel toward your game being released is somehow not good, because it is the case that oftentimes, if we go to a conference or take the time putting these talks together, we get a lot of stuff personally out of it, right? It's just the case that as the business has matured and the amount of responsibility has gone up, what previously felt like a relatively even trade there has become, because it's not really quantifiable, in terms of, if Seth gives his, say his talk on Levelhead and DevOps, and that helps us clarify just internally in the studio a bit more of our DevOps understanding. It's just impossible to know how exactly that has cascaded in useful ways, right? For us internally. It has, I guarantee it has, but how exactly, I don't know.
Yeah, you can't put a number on it.
It's so basically as the actual number gets bigger, right? Associated with not participating in, say, moving the studio project forward, whatever, then it becomes harder to more calmly be like, we're going to take the time to do.
Right. Because you're saying it's a
Something we
guaranteed cost,
Exactly.
which is always increasing, and then a possible return, which you can't measure. So at a certain point, you start to bias toward but there's also, I think there's a point on the other side of it.
There is. Yep.
Where like if your company gets big enough, so if you think about like BlizzCon, right, where they have several different IPs, they got Overwatch, Warcraft, Diablo, and then they do have StarCraft, but they keep forgetting about it, but it's there. And then there's some new IP, I think that they're probably going to unveil.
And they've got thousands of employees, right? So the
But yeah,
scale is different.
that's it. Yeah, they have
millions of players per IP, tens of millions of players per IP.
Yeah, so they
thousands
can fill
of
a convention, and they have employees and different so they'll have here's some of the art team from this game, right? And they're doing a panel, right? And so you don't have to shut down production of the whole game because you're putting on this convention, right? You just grab these few artists, be like, yeah, you're going to do a panel, just answer questions. You don't have to prep, right?
Yep.
Just show up, do the panel, right? And then you'll have the game director come up and give a keynote or something. And so you have a whole bunch of different people who are involved in the game's production get to take their turn and do their little thing. And it's not like each one of them has to figure out how to entertain an audience for 3 whole days by themselves, kind of thing. So
I think it's actually a weird thing where I think in the, like Adam was saying, in the early days, I think it's also an early part of the social media experience, which was that it largely felt like it was almost like a new responsibility that you had to be managing this personal brand thing.
That's how that's how it's presented to you. Is that
personal brand,
personal brand,
and you have to do it.
Yep. Which in retrospect, frankly, is insane because of the scaling problem, which is the reality is if you're looking at any celebrity, anybody who is actually a brand, right? I'm not talking about Jerry.
They have a PR team,
but I'm talking about there's a team, right? They are the tip of the spear for these things. But if you're, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, you're not going to be managing your interview schedule during a movie, between your acting.
You'll show up to the interview, but planning the interview and figuring out, doing all the research to prep, it's you're paying somebody else to do that.
Yeah.
Somebody shows up, they give you some cliff notes, and that's your prep, and then you walk in.
Yeah.
Right?
So I do think there's a really interesting interaction with the scale, which basically it's some things like Twitter or Instagram or whatever else, they're very attractive to you when you're trying to get started because, of course, it does allow you to show your work to some people, right? Or to get some interest. But I think the reality is as you scale, there's basically this point, this midpoint, right? Where it takes enough time away from doing the thing that it becomes harder and harder to make it all make any sense because you can't full-time both simultaneously. And then there's on the other side where if you can cross over that where the team gets big enough, studio gets big enough, the games get big enough that you can actually have someone managing those things for you and then kind of just show up. It's you're just showing up to a panel. Panels are great. I love panels.
Yeah. I think as with all things, it's just there's a romance associated with really underappreciating the logistics behind these things and just seeing the end result, right? So we talk about this a lot when people talk about, I'd love to be an author. And what being an author means is largely being alone in front of a computer typing for thousands of hours, which you could just do that. You could do it over the weekend. You could do it every weekend. You could do it. It's just sitting at your computer typing a whole fuckload. But people don't mean that when they say, I want to be an author. They say what they mean is I want to, show up at a book signing of a book that I've already written with thousands of adoring fans. That's what they want. And
I want to have written a book, right? Which is I want to have written a book. I get it,
Yeah, which is very different than I want to be an author. Those are two
I don't want to
different.
write that book. I just want to have already written it,
Yeah. And so this is kind of the same where it's easy to think that that's a desirable thing if you're only thinking about the sort of outward perception of it that you have experienced as a final product, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to what's actually happening behind the scenes to make the thing happen. And once you really get a taste for that, oftentimes you're like, you know what? I'm good, actually.
Yeah, if you see any of the behind the scenes stuff for any major content creator or social media personality or whatever, it's just every waking moment of their lives is like, how do I stay on top of the algorithm? How do I make enough content? How do I convert every facet of my life into content?
I think it was like when they're talking about Ninja, who had that huge rise a couple of years ago.
Yeah, Fortnite streamer. Yeah.
And then it was revealed like he had been basically every single day. You're not taking a day off for like 2
he streamed for like 12 hours a day or something.
It's like 16 hours. It was insane. And I was like, that sounds like
everybody's like, this guy is some kid. He just plays video games all day. It's like, but like all day, and not games. He plays one game
and
for 16 hours,
entertaining a community via his chat and other social media platforms.
Yeah,
right? Like,
because I don't know if anybody has like tried to play a game for 16 hours straight for your own enjoyment without an audience, and even that is like it's doable, but it does get really, really exhausting. By the time you get to the end. So at hour 8, you're kind of like, oh, like
my body hurts.
I'm gonna die. Yeah. So none of this stuff is easy, and if you're a spectator of it, you can just dip in and catch a little enjoyment of it, and then just dip right back out again. It's kind of like being an uncle versus being a parent. You could just show up, cause some chaos, and bail, and you haven't had to do any of the shit involved with actually making this thing happen.
I guess the list is long.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
that's my
I would say that the short of it is that it's extremely expensive to do all that stuff. Some of that seems fun, like putting on a convention or whatever.
It is fun once it's done.
Yeah,
once you're there.
And some of it that either seems fun or seems like you have to, either way, right? But all that stuff is just extremely time expensive, and the reality is that for the vast majority of people, it isn't worth the cost. Like if you look back in retrospect, right? But there might be some other things that you get out of it. You might get a community out of it of other people trying to do the same thing. You might get some of your early fans into it and so on, right? If you're looking at pure like cost effectiveness, it's not there. It is not there at all, right? Because it is a factor of scale. And that kind of definitionally means at the beginning when your scale is 0, that's the least cost effective it could possibly be, right?
Yep.
It's just that when you're not measuring things in money and runway and whatever, and you're just measuring things in time, which tends to be the trajectory for people in their creative careers, right? Then it's easy to write off that time, and it's also easy to see like 100 followers as a really big achievement, which it is, because going from 0 to 100 is really impressive.
It's crazy. I mean, the thing is, we were shocked when we had like 30 people or 40 people show up at Shenanigans.
Yeah,
and like most of them drove from all over the place, and it was
awesome. Truly amazing, right? But it's also one of those. But it's also true that at that scale, that had 0 impact on our long-term success of the studio, right? Which wasn't the point, so that's fine, right? That's not why we were doing it. But
and you're not gonna like bring in new players, right? By throwing a convention for fans.
It is for the existing community.
It's fan service.
Yeah. Just want to hang out. So they're so fun to do, but it's a hard one. I mean, honestly, things. That's the thing. Make Crashlands 2 go wish list on Steam. That's what I'm saying. Make that thing go big, and then we'll put another one on after Garrett. That's also
If we sell a few million copies of Crashlands 2, we'll think about it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if we didn't have to worry about our runway because we just were set,
then you could do whatever.
Because the fact is, like, I want to be streaming like development stuff, and I want to make more of our stuff publicly visible because then I can talk about it. It's just the value proposition is
you got to be rich enough that you got to be rich enough that there's no stakes anymore.
Yeah,
Well, I'll just do whatever.
That's even open sourcing something like so. Yesterday I published a new Visual VS Code extension that's purely for internal purposes, right? Which is basically it's a text-based editor for our Quest stuff, right? And I was trying to decide like what to do with this. I was like, it's such a pain in the ass to like deal with stuff in a private way, right? But if it's just published publicly in VS Code, then like anybody on the team can just go get it, and then it'll be auto updated and all that stuff, you know. And I thought about it for like 5 minutes. So it didn't take very long to reach the conclusion that like it's fine if this is public. It doesn't leak anything of significance or whatever, right? But we still have occasions though with things like this where
you have to be close.
Where you just have to like, you're just like, oh shit, I just can't. I guess another example is Seth submitted a bug ticket to Yo-Yo last week. And
to GameMaker. Yo-Yo Games has ceased to be.
But it is to Yo-Yo Games GitHub, because that's still the name of their GitHub.
Oh, that's okay, fair.
Technically.
But so we out technicaled each other. Or we out actually at each other. But it was about an animation problem with Spine, which is the software that makes these like little animated versions of 2D things, right? And so that's what GameMaker uses, and so that's what we use. And there was a new issue where there was something that got janky at certain frame rates and stuff. So Seth put together a report and needed a sample project to fire off with it and so on. But there's like, what sample animation do I include? Right? Because
it's like, well, all the animations we have are from Crashlands 2.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah. It's just public
so,
now, right?
Yeah. You could rope Sam in and have him waste his time making a whole new animation and trying to recreate the exact bug,
Yep.
Or just fucking submit one of our Crashlands 2 sprites as a bug. So that's what I did.
Just say it's probably fine. Like we're not changing the licensing on it to say you can use this, right? Or whatever. So like which makes it like now it's leaked rather than just made public, if that kind of makes sense, right?
But what's leaked is just like a picture of something one thing in the game, which we've already shown on trailers, and and also like by the time we launch the game, that sprite will have changed a lot anyways, and so essentially it's somebody has a useless and outdated piece of imagery from the game. Yeah. So,
but it is still one of those things that where every time we're doing any of these kinds of things, or we're talking about, we want to make some content for about behind the scenes stuff about how we're making Crashlands 2, but then there's still the question is like, but what are the
implications?
What are the implications? And also, like, again, it's like these just take time, but they wouldn't really do much for us, right? So mostly we want to do them because they're fun to do, but then they have all these risks associated with them, and then they also just take away time from making it more likely we get to keep doing this, right?
Yeah. Well, they talk about on entrepreneurship. There is this middle death valley that a lot of companies essentially die in, which is that you have enough business, right, to like pay yourselves to start expanding a bit, but you don't have so much that you essentially are well insulated from either mistakes or just things that you thought would be fun to do that were maybe more expensive than you anticipated, or didn't make any sense necessarily to the bottom line, but were serving some other purpose entirely, community building, whatever, right? And there's this gap where like you're actually still in a place where you actually have a lot to lose, right? So people's risk tolerance goes down. But at the same time, it's like you don't quite have enough bandwidth to be essentially flinging around some extra weight, and doing some of these things that you want to do. But it feels like sometimes you can, and so you have this little bit of a trap where you can.
I think it's about self-sufficiency of the company, right? Because if you think about like the startup process, right, is somebody who has gotten money somehow, whether they're just sitting on it, supportive spouse, got funding, whatever, who then starts a venture where that venture is not like so like when in our early days we had health insurance through other means, right?
Obamacare.
Through Obamacare, through spouses or whatever, and we were also supported through spouses, right? So and otherwise through like money we had saved in our time up to that point, right? So
we strung stuff together.
The company wasn't self-sufficient by any stretch, right? It's basically we're putting the costs elsewhere, and then over time, as you actually start to get success, you start to pull those costs into the company. So the company itself is becoming the entity that creates that. You're not relying on external sources to keep the thing going, or people who are fresh out of college and maybe in a privileged enough position where they can have a low salary for a while, like that kind of stuff, right? So much of what you're doing in the early phases of this stuff, whether it's a solo or whether it's a small group, is putting the costs somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm.
But the costs, they're there.
They're there and they're really expensive, right? You just put them somewhere else. But over time, as you manage to pull them, but what success basically means is you've pulled those costs into the company, right? Mm-hmm. And the company is now able to, but also has to pay for those, right? So it moves you from this position where it feels like, and I think this idea of like that death gap, you know, I think it's
an illusion.
Yeah, it's actually it's a transition between you basically, what's the word for that where you're using other people's resources to prop yourself up, you know, whatever, or other resources. There's a word that I'm looking for. I don't know what it is, but
like it's like a debt, like, right? You're leveraging all these other ways of it's propping up the company. You know?
Yeah, it's like how a lot of really large companies pay their employees really poorly to the point where huge fractions of their workforce are on public assistance programs of various sorts, right? And they're
in the U.S.
Yeah. So they're basically
it's about Walmart specifically, probably.
Yeah. So it's a part of the way that they prop up their company is by the reliance on the fact that their employees will actually get money from some external source completely, right? But that's also like that's how a startup works. That's how we start, right? In this whole thing is it's all external. So I think it's got to be that point where the more stuff you actually are able to internalize, and also the other thing you're doing is you're offsetting the future, right? Because you're also saying things like, well, we're not making enough money to survive like for the long term right now.
Yeah.
But if this is successful, then we can kind of back pay and it'll be fine, right? So you're also borrowing from some kind of nebulous future. And so all those things start to arrive as you get some level of success. And holy shit, is it really expensive to actually have a company that is actually paying people, actually providing health, actually doing all these things, right? In a way that means that if those people continue to work there indefinitely, that their quality of life would be good and stay good, right?
Yeah.
So when you're not borrowing anymore from like a nebulous future where everybody gets paid more, where you're not borrowing from people's external sources of
support.
Yeah. Essentially, like being a small startup is all about not doing things.
Yeah.
And then starting to reach any tier of success means the bills start to come due, right? Yeah. And like that's the point where things
those
get a little
shits are expensive. I remember the first time we saw some number at some point that we just balked at in our earlier days where it was but it was also we were making fun of it because it was like a San Francisco company where everything was infinitely more expensive, you know. Mm-hmm. And they were like, we basically assume that it costs us $10,000 a month to have an employee, right? That was the number that we saw. Mm-hmm. And we're looking at over here in the Midwest being
any employee, no matter what.
Yeah.
No matter what you're actually doing.
And we're like, you're not paying people that. And we're like, $120K is like that's a great salary, right? So we're like, you know, that just seemed like so much to be like, no matter what you're doing, it's going to cost. But then for a while we had an office and then we got health insurance, we got 401k, and, you know, we have all these things now and we're paying people decent salaries, right?
Payroll tax.
And holy shit, once you tie all those things together and once the
that sounds right.
come into play, it really is so
even just the idea of like payroll tax, which is that, you know, and like if you haven't been on the other side of payroll, like if you've only received your paycheck and never had to like compose one and hand it out to somebody, which you don't realize, and it's often hidden from you in various ways, or unless you're looking for it, is that the payroll tax is tacked on top of your salary that the company pays.
Yeah.
And it's generally something like 10% or 10 to 15% or something like that. So that means like if your salary is $100,000, for example, then that company had to pay $10,000 in taxes just for the privilege of giving you the $100,000. Mm-hmm. And then when you get the $100,000, the government takes income tax from you, right? So it's like you and the company are paying taxes on both sides of it. And so when you're looking at the numbers of like, here's what it costs to have an employee, and in many cases, neither the company nor the employee gets chunks of that money. It just goes away.
It's just gone.
It's just gone.
But it's also like because your legal requirements go up. Because I remember there was when we put Crashlands into Apple Arcade, that's Crashlands Plus, right? We were confronted with the fact that our business insurance was insufficient for Apple's liking, right? And so we had to and we already had to have business insurance anyway, because it's a thing once you start employing people, you have to do, right? And then all of a sudden it was like, we need a $2 million policy or something like that.
Which is a bigger one.
Cost us $2 million. It just means that's how much
it's what it covers,
and so we had to go through that. Because we have all this web stuff we're doing, we have to deal
Privacy
with
shield.
privacy stuff. And so now we have GDPR compliance we have to deal with, right? Like the list. And then, of course, everybody has subscription services, like a jillion of them that we're paying for and managing, right? And just the sheer volume of stuff.
It's just the more if you want to do stuff, there's an infinite list of things that keep coming up that you just have to keep doing, you know? So, it's pretty tough. So, let's get to the next question.
Yeah,
this next question comes from Mimmabip Gourkee, who says, I like this. This is a good one. Who says, what's the reason why you opt in to displaying GameMaker's splash screen? Some gamers think there's a strong correlation to the quality of a game based on the engine used. Unreal has marketed themselves to reach out even to gamers where they seem to think everything is bad unless it's made in Unreal. Even if only a very small portion of players have a negative reaction to knowing what engine a game was made in before they play it, I can't think of a positive reason to include it that would outweigh this. All right, so this is interesting because this is not what you think. So for starters, we don't display GameMaker's splash screen. There's a built-in splash screen in GameMaker that for quite a while, I don't know if this is still true, but for quite a while, it was forced to display on people who on games that were made using the free tier of GameMaker.
So
essentially
same thing.
Part of the benefit of paying premium is that you don't have the splash screen pop up, right?
Yeah.
In theory.
So Unity did the same thing, and the thinking from these companies was, well,
exposure bucks,
exposure bucks. Most people using our product are using the free tier because that's just how money works and stuff, right? Which means a huge majority of the games made in our software, we are not getting any kickback from at all. It's just a cost. So can we turn these games into an advertising opportunity by forcing our splash screen in front of them so that any players will see that our engine exists?
Yeah, while also adding an incentive to the developer to pay up some cash. They don't have to do that. So they get to feel like they fully own the thing that they made on the other side. Right?
Yeah. So the downside of this is the people making high quality professional tier games who are paying for licenses and paying for enterprise software, et cetera, do not advertise the fact that they made this great game with your engine. Meanwhile, every hobbyist who slaps together a game in 30 minutes is putting your engine's logo in front of it, right? Yeah. So Unity has this problem. GameMaker had this problem where it creates a perception that the engine is bad.
Because the only time you see the engine symbol is before a bad big gameplay experience.
Yeah. And so like Unreal Engine is great. It's very easy to make absolute shit games with Unreal Engine because it's absolutely easy to make shit games with anything because making shit is easy. So for starters,
even in Unreal, you know, and in Unreal, it's more likely that your shit game just looks good right out of the gate, but
it's going to look great.
Probably can't run on it.
It's going to be shit, but you know, it's going to look amazing. And so there, for starters, like this perception of the engine somehow dictating anything about the quality of the game is it's dumb. I'll just say it's dumb.
I would say it's a reasonable inference, right? From
given the evidence that you see.
Given the evidence. Yeah. But it is not related to.
But if you think about it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other part of the perception too, right, is that like Unreal is in C++. It's for hardcore, serious
hardcore
game developers, right? So the idea is that there's the impression that there's a bar that people kind of have to have already met to be using the engine in the first place. And Unity, same kind of a deal, except that bar is way lower because it's like really focused on their. Is it blueprints in Unity? No, that's Unreal.
No, that's Unreal. They just have the editor in Unity.
Whatever there, yeah. But it's the same idea, and it's got it's a friendlier language, you know, so it's easier, it's more accessible, right? And then GameMaker, same deal all over again, only even more accessible. It's only, I guess, I'm going to say 2D. Only 2D. I know they'll tell you, hey, you can do 3D stuff, but it's just if you're going to do 3D, use something else. You know, that it's wild that people do that. But it's like it's a garbage collected language that's really JavaScripty, you know, and for a long time until a few years ago was lacking any modern niceties of like programming languages that you'd expect. And so it was really, it had this like drag and drop kind of.
I think as soon as you say drag and drop, people are like, oh, it's for babies.
Exactly.
And which of course Unreal Engine has drag and drop.
No, they're called blueprints. Okay.
Oh yeah, sorry.
You
Yeah,
take this.
yeah. So, but it's, these engines are all capable of incredible things, right? And so it really just comes down to the creator. And so when it comes to this question of, well, like, why are we displaying the GameMaker splash screen, and why would we ever do that if there's only downsides? Essentially, is the framing of this, right? Because there are people who don't care, and then there's people who have a negative reaction. Yep. Well, so we actually talked with the GameMaker team and said, we want to show your splash screen in front of our game, because if
it's
we
annoying
have
that people only think that the engine that we use is garbage.
Yeah. In the long term, we want people to have a more positive association with the game engine that we use, right?
Yeah. And in that conversation with them, we said, well, all right, so for starters, we don't want just a picture. We want to make a splash screen that actually is like looks good and is animated and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we worked with them to put together an animated splash screen that no other game actually has. And there's like sound effects to it and stuff like that, right? Like that splash screen is not actually GameMaker's splash screen.
That's true. I forgot about that.
We made that with them.
Because their splash screen sucks.
It's just a picture. It's just a picture. Yeah. And so in the conversation we had with them about wanting to do that, that was when we also talked to them about considering not force showing the splash screen on unpaid versions of GameMaker, because we're like,
in fact, ideally do the opposite, if anything, you know.
Yeah, because we're like, we want GameMaker to be a successful, well-respected engine, because that comes back to us, right? Like if they sell more copies and can expand their support staff and engineering, et cetera, then that's great for us, right? Yep. And so it's less about, I think it's the thing we try to do with all things, which is try to play the long game, right? Mm-hmm. Like think in the long term of what's gonna make your life easier and better in 5 years or 10 years. And for us, it's like, well, we are tethered to this engine. Mm-hmm. Everything that we've done is tied to the success of GameMaker. And so we want people to know about it because it helps us, right?
Yeah. So, but also I think this perception there's risk involved with us like showing that is nonsense, because when does a person see that splash screen, right? It's when they're booting up the game to play it. Yeah. So if the person is so incensed by the idea that it's a GameMaker game that they see the splash screen and quit before they even play the game, then like that's the kind of person I don't want to be dealing with, kind of.
Well, you're unlikely to with them because you have to pay for our games too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Or if it's a subscription, or if you don't, then it's a subscription service. Then
still got to download it. There's still a whole thing, you know. I don't believe there are people out there, who like. I do believe there are people out there who, when they see like the logo for the engine, get put into a certain kind of a tone where they're like, where they now look at the game differently as it comes up, right? Historically, what that's been for us for our games is that it's happily surprised instantly, like the moment they.
We're just gonna lower your expectations real quick, just so we can knock them out.
So again, even if you have those low expectations for like our games, the end effect actually seems to be still more positive than anything, because people come in and they're just like,
because it's not a shit game.
Yeah, so they're just pleasantly surprised. So again, I just don't think there's any actual harm to using it, because
it's fine.
You don't use the opening of your actual game once it's deployed into people's hands as part of your marketing strategy. You know,
they've already got it.
They've already got
the game.
You've already done the hard part. You got the game to them, right?
That is the hard part. Getting somebody to get the dang game and boot it up. Like, if you've gotten that far, your
splash screen doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's tough to kind of like push against these, but it actually reminds me a lot of when Baldur's Gate came out. I saw this huge volume of people who said something along the lines of, I didn't want to buy this because I hate turn-based games, but I decided to give it a try, and it's amazing. I'm like, so
this is the usual. It's usual. There's a genre. Everyone's got their genre that they're into. You know, and like people. But
there's a difference between being into something and categorically deciding that you'll never interact with something.
I think for a lot of people, there's not a difference. Yeah, I think you're right that if you take a nuanced view on stuff and are a curious person who just like likes to know, and if you're a person who understands that a label is an assistive tool to get a rough idea of something rather than any kind of an accurate descriptor, right? Yeah. So that you're using those things in that way, and then you're just curious about stuff, then I agree with you that these are completely separate ways of like approaching the world. But I think for most people, their razor for how they go through life, you know, is like
high level labels.
There's so many things right?
Yep.
So there's stuff that I love and there's stuff that I hate. And I use the category to separate those things because anything else requires time and like
I don't got it.
nuance and whatever. And I don't got it. But also it lets me find my tribe. And now I have things that I can make fun of and hate with other people and things that I can love and
What a good
enjoy
time.
with other people. And so I get my tribe at the same time, you know, and like, so there are all these, the way
That's
that
true. Being part of a group of people is oftentimes about choosing a thing to collectively dump on.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's why we have
Either
the
thing
rule
you
in our
love or
Discord of let people like what they like for exactly that reason. Because people's tendency is to do exactly that.
Yep.
I
So
mean,
it's so we decided, you know, people have biases, but we think that a good game can overcome those biases, you know? And so we thought we wanted GameMaker to be more successful. So that was our decision. I think that's probably all the time we have. We could try to do another one, but you know,
Do you got a short one in there, or is it?
I mean, there's
yeah, well, maybe.
Let's go. Let's do it. We got
Okay.
some- we got
So
some news.
our last question comes from FlyhoppieAxerompa, who says, this is about Crashlands 2, who says, are the new combat telegraph shapes for show, or are you actually doing precise collisions? If so, do you do anything special besides clicking the precise collision checkbox in GameMaker?
actually,
So I'll kind of
this is interesting from a design perspective too, because this is the number one kind of critical thing that people had with the Ballyhoo about these, right? Was the question of like, do I really have to like, especially with the knuckles, where it's like two knuckles and like it's like the place in between, there's nothing, right, that you would actually hit. And people are like, do I really have to like line that up? And that seems like it would suck. Right, was kind of the impression that people got. So yeah, it's a good question for all these.
Well, the answer is
topics.
yes. You do have to line it up. It does not suck.
Yeah, that's exactly
So-
yeah. If it
I
sucked,
don't know why
we would.
Yeah, I don't know why
do
you
it.
jump there. You know what I mean? You could just you got to line it up. That's true. But as far as how you're doing that calculation, I have no idea what.
So all right, so basically, I'll give like a very brief descriptor of kind of like the way that you would do collision checking in a game, and then like kind of what we're doing. So collision checking in a game is just, are these things overlapping? If yes, they are colliding, and then you can have something happen. So that's like, you know, if your character's supposed to like stop when they hit a wall or something like that, which is actually harder than you'd think because you're actually not supposed to go into the wall, which means you're not supposed to collide with the wall. You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's tricky.
Don't get inside there because
So-
then you vibrate and get shot into space.
Yeah. And so being able to just ask that question, are these two things overlapping, it's one of the perennial questions of being a game developer.
It's the main question, really.
It's the
really
main
is,
question. Yeah. And so there are ways to do it that are cheap and fast. So a good example would be if you have two things that have circular collision masks, they're just circles, then to ask whether they're overlapping, you just add their two radii together and then just see how far apart their midpoints are and then just be like,
Boom, done.
are they close? Are they closer than this or farther than this? So you're just going to like do a quick distance calculation and compare two numbers. Easy peasy.
But
right?
what if you have a wacky ass knuckle shaped telegraph?
If you've got something that is
Concave, convex, doing all sorts of weird shit.
very weirdly shaped, then the GameMaker's built-in kind of way of handling this is something called precise collision checking, which means that pixel by pixel, this thing will be checked.
very expensive.
That shit, yeah, that is
We're talking
Almost
expensive in compute
in computation.
requirements,
Yeah, if you do precise collision checking, you're going to have a bad time.
Yep.
And so we don't do precise collision checking. And also the other thing with those collision checks is you need a sprite. You need an image in order for the pixels to be calculated, right? Our telegraphs in Crashlands 2 are not sprites,
They don't
and
exist.
they do not use precise collision checking
What?
from GameMaker. But they do precise collision checks, but of my own homebrew variety. So basically, the telegraphs that you see behind the scenes are just made out of circles and triangles.
Primitives. They're easy
yeah.
to do the calculation.
Those are the two primitives, and then we can take the circles and like turn them into donuts by cutting out the center, and also turn them into arc shapes by just slicing out other parts of the circle, right? So then since the telegraphs are visually, they have these interesting shapes to them, but behind the scenes they're composed of these two types of primitives. Then our collision checking isn't about checking pixel by pixel. It's just about
run through the primitives and ask, do any of these primitives overlap? Right?
Is this triangle overlapping? And also the characters or like the things that you're hitting, they have pretty simple hitboxes where either it's like a square shaped base or a circular shaped base. So that asking like, is this triangle overlapping this circle? There's some math there that you can do that's not about checking every individual pixel kind of a thing. So yeah, so just a matter to like coming up with the code to ask about those primitives, and then also making the code to take those primitives and turn them into an image, like to render them out into a sprite, which is just a little bit of shader.
Do you also do
bit of
an early check where you have like a bounding box around the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's another thing. That's another common trick that you'll use is because you have to figure out first, basically, to avoid doing expensive calculations that you wouldn't need to do. You see, is there a cheap one I can do to like tell me just, is it even possible that I would need to do these calculations, right? So for that, you can basically draw a circle around the whole thing or a square, right? But circle for ease, you draw a circle around the whole thing, and then you first ask, is there anything within this circle, like any of these things that I need to check for, right? And if the answer is no, don't bother doing all those complicated
don't worry about
checks, you know? And you can further break things down if you need to into like, oh, now I've got it in quadrants. I can do it in whatever, right? And you see this for pathfinding and for all kinds of stuff. Anything that's really computationally difficult, you'll have all these like early outs and all these like higher level questions you can ask first to be like, is it even possible that I would need to do this? And you try to put your cheap calculations up high so you can early exit and not do those really expensive ones. And so much of optimization of games is just that.
And I will say, one of the benefits too of the system as it's implemented is that the calculation is done at a moment in time. In the case of like a telegraph,
in one frame,
in one frame, which means that this isn't a constant check. It's not you running against a wall and us asking constantly, but are you in that wall? Are you in that wall? Are you in like every single frame trying to make sure that you don't slip into it, right? We don't have to do that because it's just when the hit lands, that's when you do the check. So it ends up being less expensive than you'd imagine.
Yeah, and the visuals of it are pre-rendered, right? So then, which like we compile those, and then they're just pre-rendered. So that way, like we don't have to spend any computation showing you the telegraph. And then, like Sam said, we just use the collision checks in one frame. So it's pretty cheap. It is the case though that like we're starting to have a lot of them, like quite a lot. And so I'll probably need to add some cleanup steps and stuff so that we can kind of like compose the images on the fly whenever you're using that weapon or that thing. And then if you haven't used that thing or haven't seen that telegraph in a while, then we can just like
purge it,
eat that thing out of memory and get rid of it, you know? Because like on mobile and stuff like that, the texture memory of all those telegraphs is starting to get a little big. I mean, this reminds me a lot of like the business stuff we're talking about, which is like, some things are going to work and be cheap. And then as you start to scale, the bill comes due at some point and you've got to kind of redo some things or it's going to get real bad. So, but yeah, it's, and it took weeks. It took several weeks to come up with this telegraph system and how to do all the collision checking. So it's,
it's not trivial.
I understand if you're a game maker user and you're like, how the fuck? It was hard. It was very hard. And it took a long time.
But now that is the thing. We just make whatever shapes we want in the back,
Yeah. With our little editor in the Game Changer. So, all right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you very much for the questions. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sam Butterscotch, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And also, as always, if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It helps boost it in the Steam charts and gets more exposure, and it helps us out in the long run. So if you haven't done that yet, we'd appreciate it. Please do. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.